Today we will talk about the story of the Soviet men who were able to do the unimaginable, paratroopers who jumped from planes without parachutes. Their feat is so great that today it is remembered all over the world, and it is a highly mythologized story because of how fantastic it sounds. So in addition to telling it, we will thoroughly evaluate its truthfulness, Guns Club style, with in-depth research. I'll tell you right now that the story is very likely to be true, although with some nuances, so I won't take up any more of your time. Make yourself comfortable, get ready for an interesting story, and of course, welcome to Guns Club. Being a paratrooper is probably the hardest job in war. Going hundreds of kilometers per hour and then jumping out into open air right into enemy territory is something truly incredible that only the bravest are capable of doing. But among all the paratroopers in history, the Soviets were probably the most impressive. In fact, they were the first to create airborne military units in 1930. Paratroopers during the early stages and beginning of World War II were deployed from TB-3 bombers. These, not having large doors to allow the paratroopers, sin chocar con la cola por supuesto, would climb onto the sturdy wings of the TB-3S in flight and hold on to specialized handrails anchored to the fuselage. That's right, they traveled on the outside of the plane. They were exposed to conditions of -40 degrees, but the low speed of the TB-3S and the cold weather gear made all of this possible. This information will be important later on. During World War II, the Soviets didn't have many opportunities to use paratroopers, but in one of those battles where they were deployed, it became legendary. Winter of 1942, after the unfortunate defeat the Germans suffered in the Battle of Moscow, the Soviets wanted to push the Germans as far away from the capital as possible. After the Soviet offensive in Moscow, the Germans were scattered in several areas. One of them was the area mantenida por el Cuarto Ejército Alemán. Para esto se inició la ofensiva soviética de Vyazma. Hablar de esta operación es un tema extenso que tomaría más de los 10 minutos habituales, así que, en síntesis, esta larga batalla fue toda una carnicería del lado soviético. No se sabe cuántos caídos hubieron, pero fueron números similares a los de Stalingrado. Parte de la ofensiva soviética consistía en el uso de fuerzas aéreas. Transported, the first time they were used extensively by the Soviet side in World War II. These troops were deployed west of Vyazma to destroy any logistical routes or communications that supplied the Fourth Army. The enemy continues to land airborne troops west of Vyazma. The Smolensk-Vyazma road and railway have not yet been cleared of the enemy. The situation for the Fourth Army is very serious. General Franz Halder reflected on the situation on the battlefield at that time. These airborne operations were very unique. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, it destroyed as many airfields as it could, destroying a large part of the bombers and aircraft used to carry paratroopers. So for many of these operations, the slow TB-3S were used. This made the fatality rate on these missions very high and the accuracy very low. At one point, an attack on logistical infrastructure further south in Yelnya was required. This attack had to be very precise and fast, since the defenses were strong and there was no time to regroup. There was no other option but a precise deployment of paratroopers, so to make it possible, a very original approach was used. The TB-3S would enter enemy territory at a normal altitude, and as they approached the target, they would drastically descend to 15 meters above the ground, almost skimming the ground and the trees. They wanted the drop zone to be an open and flat field, which, due to the harsh winter, was covered in snow. The TB-3 aircraft, particularly slow planes, would fly at 50 km per hour as low as possible, at which point the soldiers would jump to the ground without parachutes. Thanks to the thick layers of snow in the area, the paratroopers' fall was cushioned and they were able to enter combat immediately. This is how German Lieutenant Ivan von Huber remembers it. In his book Attention Paratroopers, he wrote, "I lack words to express my admiration for these men. It was a genuinely Russian method of airborne deployment, unparalleled in the world. Bombers that flew lentamente descendían sobre un low over the snow and the paratroopers jumped into the snow without parachutes and then immediately entered combat. Despite the tragic situation our troops were in, I couldn't help but admire their bravery and audacity, which vividly reminded me of the traditional Russian pastime of riding a troika. During the offensives in Sierzbierbiasma, the bold Soviet airborne groups managed to lure several German divisions to the rear, making success at the front possible for the ground troops, and in the end, the collapse of the Fourth Army in the area. The story I just told you is not a legend, it's a fairly popular story in the former Soviet republics. It's like that typical story you share with your family. And although it's generally debated, it's taken as true, since magazine articles and internet historians base their accounts on the memoirs that General Akhmar Vongov wrote in his book. Determining the truth of this story is simple. I just read the book, and it's good. I highly recommend it. Although it's a bit dense, it's very informative. And indeed, on page 157 the quote appears. It's not as flattering towards the Soviets as it is in the Russian articles. Gub just narrated what he saw. Soviet paratroopers jumping without parachutes. So yes, there is an important witness, so the story should be real, right? Well, these heroic stories have been investigated throughout the 20th century. It's a pretty popular story, and a paratrooper, Colonel Ivan Startsak, wrote about it in his memoirs, and according to historians, after checking, it's completely false. In his book, he wrote that it was true they made jumps from really low altitudes, about 100 meters. And maybe that's why the Germans thought the paratroopers were jumping without parachutes. In addition, they used white parachutes that could be mistaken for clouds, creating an optical illusion from the ground. Most historians use this testimony to dismiss what General von Gub saw. However, I don't think it's as definitive as historians make it out to be. Starchak was an exceptional commander who wasn't sitting behind a desk but fought alongside his men. To me, that's the only kind of leader worth following. The problem with his testimony is that Operation Reshev's meat grinder, more than 10,000 paratroopers were deployed, 37,000 according to Almark's book. Von Gub, although Starczak trained men, coordinated operations, and also hundreds of men passed under his command throughout the entire operation. What von Gub saw may have happened outside his jurisdiction, so his testimony is nowhere near definitive, although it helps us see that it was definitely not something standardized, but rather, if it happened, it was a measure. What von Gub describes is too specific to be an optical illusion. It's not the same to see a plane flying at 100 meters as it is to see it skimming the ground, so close to the ground that it allowed men to jump to the ground. He also literally says that he saw them fall into the deep snow and go out to fight, so we can infer that he was on the front line when he saw them fall. Also, if we read carefully, he had no doubt about what he saw. He was very specific. He didn't say, "It seemed like." He described exactly what he saw. And I don't think there's a paratrooper camouflage that's so perfect it could be 100% effective. Curiously, something that does make me a bit suspicious is that the character Bongo himself is extremely mysterious. There's very little information about him. The book provides us with this, but there are no records of his existence, no German documentation to back it up in any way, not even a group photo. That's something relatively normal since he was just another lieutenant and only became famous for his memoirs after the war. But even his book is strange, since I couldn't find an original German version of the book he supposedly wrote. The oldest version I found was a Soviet translation, which I suspect might be more of a compilation of his memoirs than a book he personally wrote. Von Gogh could easily be an invented character, or his memoirs could have been used as propaganda in the Soviet Union, although due to my limitations, we won't be able to find out through this research. We could analyze this mathematically with physics as we usually do in these cases, but in any case, it wouldn't be something definitive either. Apparently, this is one of those stories that are impossible to completely dismiss or confirm. It's up to the listener to decide whether it's real or not. In my opinion, and as Von Gogh says, it's a very Soviet way of making things complicated. It sounds like something a Soviet commander would actually do with his men. But what do you think? Why did the Soviets hate wearing helmets? In this video, you'll see the answer.